Hello, welcome. You are with Dr. Sushma Singh. Today in Unit 10, Social and Human Development, let us start growth models of economic development, and under subtopic is structural change model. Following the prescription of the Harrod and Domer, who feel that the main obstacles or constraints to development is the relatively low level of new capital formation in most poor countries, Arthur Lewis comes up with another variation in the growth model. According to him, investments in industrialization would attract rural folk to urban areas, and this in turn would provide higher standard of living as they would earn more wages. Furthermore, as the level of labor productivity was so low in traditional agricultural areas, people living in the rural areas would have virtually no impact on output. Indeed, the amount of food available to the remaining villagers would increase as the same amount of food could be shared among fewer people. This might generate a surplus which could then be sold, generating income. Those people that move away from the villages to the towns would earn increased incomes, and this in turn generates more savings, according to Lewis. The lack of development was due to the lack of saving and investment. The way to development was to increase saving and investment. A growing industrial sector requiring labor provided the income that could be spent and saved. This would in itself generate demand and also provide funds for investment. Income generated by the industrial sector was expected to trickle down throughout the economy. There was a great deal of criticism of these models from the so-called third world countries. They offered critiques which pointed out to the vested interest of these Western models. After the initial turmoil created by the dependency theories subsided and Neoclassical economists bounced back with another set of theories which became known as the Neoclassical CounterRevolution. The next theory is Neoclassical CounterRevolution. Unlike the dependence theories, which believed that underdevelopment was an externally induced phenomena, the people behind the neoclassical counter-revolution believed that the underdevelopment is an internally induced phenomena. The central argument of the neoclassical counter-revolution is that underdevelopment results from poor resource allocation due to incorrect pricing policies and too much state intervention by over-interfering governments. The third world is underdeveloped because of the heavy hand of the state and the corruption, inefficiency and lack of economic incentives that permeate the economies of developing nations. According to this theory, what is needed is the promotion of a free and open market and laissez-faire economies within the context of permissive governments that allow the magic of the marketplace and the invisible hand of market prices to guide resource allocation and stimulate economic development. Now let us start the next topic, criticism of growth-oriented theories of development, the need for a holistic perspective. The prescription offered by the above theories were adopted by the first generation of newly independent nations. They generally accepted that They were poor because they were traditional and had followed subsistence agriculture based production. Hence, there was an initial investment in heavy industries, as was done by India too. The adoption never really did yield results, and the theories themselves came under heavy criticism, especially from the hitherto colonized and newly independent nations who were in the race to climb the development ladder. Underlying these theories were a series of both economic and deeper philosophical assumptions which were highly Eurocentric or Western oriented. In some of these theories, especially Rostow's, the assumption that the underdeveloped countries have no history of development since they are still at the first stage of being a traditional society is a historical proposition. It suggested that so-called underdeveloped countries have no history of development. An examination of colonial history shows that this is not a case. The bargaining industries, mostly traditional ones, were deliberately destroyed. The destruction of the cotton textile in India is an example of that. There are numerous such instances in colonial history. Furthermore, classical and neoclassical theories with their stress on consumption and huge investment have been found to be unsustainable, upsetting the fragile ecological balance. By providing the developed West as a model to be emulated at the last stage of Rostow's model suggests, there is a continued sense of inequality as more countries compete for fewer resources. It is only the rich and powerful who invariably have access to the earth's resources, creating an inequitable situation. The developed countries account for only a quarter of the world's population. They consume approximately 80% of the world's resources. Thus, the goal of mass consumption for the developing world is impossible, as this level of consumption cannot be sustained for a large number of people. Some of these points were not only raised by the advocates of dependency theories of Latin America, but by all third world countries. And as more facts and figures started pouring in on the state of the ecology and the environment, particularly at the Earth Summit of 1990, it was realized that the growth model were far from sustainable. Most of the above discussed theories were pro-capital and pro-manufacturing. It was increasingly found that creation of surplus and more wealth did not necessarily create well-being. Not only that, the wealth which was invariably intended to tickle never did. Apart from the economic and environmental perspective, in the development critique, there was a spate of criticism from the social and cultural perspective. Though there were certain divisions and new approaches which addressed the human angles, like the human resources development approach and the basic human needs approach. The human resources development approach looked at human potential as a means to further capital accumulation. Human beings were the supply part of that commodity production, they were not the end themselves. The welfareist model and the basic needs approach looked at human beings as beneficiaries of development rather than as active participants. According to the basic needs approach, provision of basic needs such as food, water, shelter was important. In the large sense, they did not look at human beings as the goal of development. In the later 1980s and early 1990s, there were a series of development critiques which emerged within sociology and anthropology. These critiques questioned the basic philosophical and epistemological orientation of development. They felt that the development discourses drive to manipulate and dominate nature and the non-linear view of history need to be critically examined. These approaches center on the analysis of development as a cultural discourse and the role that it plays in shaping and defining reality. In many anthropologists in this framework call for the abandonment and deconstruction of the whole epistemological and political field of post-war development towards a post-development era. They argue that the pervasiveness of development discourse and ideology denaturalize the historical and political realities of the development enterprises. It is argued that development discourse acts as a regime of representation or hegemonic worldview that systematically shapes and constructs identities of the so-called third world peoples and does not allow people to think of alternative organizing principles for the attainment of well-being. Those works most associated with this type of post-development critiques are those of Arthur S. Karbar, Wolfgang Seng, Raman, and Battery. It is criticism that like these which together raise many questions on the issue of what well-being is. After all, the national averages of income or wealth do not capture the actual situation of distribution of incomes. It was increasingly realized that development has to capture the many-sided aspects of well-being that address not only the basic needs of human beings such as food, clothing, shelter, access to health, etc., but such social issues as gender equality as well and also address issues of sustainability. The holistic perspective was increasingly brought forth to the center stage, particularly in the late 1980s and 1990s. Various methods were sought to look at comparative pictures of societies that address these social issues rather than per capita income, etc. Countries which were believed to be very wealthy did not necessarily have greater equality of incomes or good human rights records. So many factors were taken into consideration which addressed the overall well-being of the people that this came to be known as human development. The United Nations Development Programme was the first to come up with a report in the year 1990 that addressed the human aspect of development. While acknowledging the importance of growth in national production, it wanted to see how this growth translates into or fails to translate into human development in various societies. We will examine this the seminal report called the Human Development Report, which was undertaken under the flagship of the project director Mehboob ul Haq. Here we want to close this lecture. Thanks for listening.